So I couldn't sleep, and when I looked outside at 5 a.m., I saw this magical snowfall happening, and it occurred to me that this would be a lovely time for a walk. Since I was thinking about the opening lecture for this course, I thought, hey, I'll bring you all along with me. What is this course about? Well, it's not a course about fixing learners or categorizing a difference. It's about understanding learning as something that always happens in context, social, cultural, political, and institutional contexts, and disability sits right in the middle of that. Education systems around the world have invested heavily in schooling for young people, and yet inequality in educational opportunity remains persistent. Access to education and to high-quality education is not evenly distributed. This isn't accidental. It reflects long-standing social practices, policies, and power structures related to race, class, language, gender identity, religion, and disability. In other words, exclusion isn't something that just happens to individuals. It's something systems produce. When we talk about inclusion, then we're not talking about a single program or placement decision. Inclusion is ongoing work. It's about identifying and challenging practices that marginalize students, sometimes quietly, sometimes overtly. And in schools, the term inclusion has been narrowed down to mean placing students with disabilities into general education classrooms. But inclusion more broadly is about recognition, belonging, and participation for students, families, and educators alike. A key concept we'll return to throughout this course is ableism. Ableism is not just about physical access to buildings, although that matters. It's a deeper belief system, one that assumes some bodies and minds are naturally better, more capable, or more valuable than others. At its core is the idea that disability represents a lesser state of being, the assumption that gets used to justify unequal access, lower expectation, and fewer opportunities. Ableism doesn't operate alone. It's deeply intertwined with other systems of oppression like racism and sexism. For example, ideas about intelligence, behavior, and, quote, normal, quote, learning are often shaped by whiteness, middle-class norms, and dominant cultural values. So when we talk about disability in education, we're always also talking about race, class, language, and power, whether we explicitly name that or not. Inclusive education from a critical perspective aims for pluralism rather than sameness. The goal is not to make everyone learn in the same way, but to create learning environments where students can connect, participate, and see themselves reflected in the school community. This work requires actively resisting ableism, racism, and other forms of structural inequity. That's why disability studies, multicultural education, and social justice education intersect so strongly. They're all concerned with how difference is treated, valued, or excluded. Disability studies specifically is not the study of diagnoses or categories. It's not another name for special education, and it's not a trend. It emerged out of disability rights movements and focuses on how disability is produced through interactions between bodies, minds, environments, policies, and professional practices. Instead of asking what's wrong with this learner, disability studies asks, what assumptions are we making and what barriers have we built? One of the most influential contributions of disability studies is the distinction between medical models and social models of disability. The medical model treats disability as a problem located in the individual, something abnormal, undesirable, and ideally corrected. In schools, this often leads to an intense focus on diagnosis, remediation, and normalization. The social model shifts that focus. It suggests that difficulty is not simply a property of a body or a mind, but of the fit between individuals and their environments. From this perspective, segregated programs, rigid curricula, and standardized expectations are not neutral. They actively create disability by limiting access and participation. This is where special education practices come into view. Historically, special education has been designated as a separate system, separate spaces, separate professionals, separate expectations. When viewed through a medical lens, this separation can appear logical or even benevolent. But from a social model perspective, segregation is not inevitable. It's the result of decisions, policy decisions, professional decisions, and cultural beliefs about normalcy. Inclusive education then shifts responsibility away from individual learners and towards schools themselves. The questions become, how are environments designed and for whom? What assumptions about learning, intelligence, and behavior are built into curriculum, assessment, and classroom organization? Critical pedagogy and social justice education deepen this analysis. They ask us to pay attention to how power operates, whose knowledge counts, whose stories are heard, and whose experiences are treated as deviations. A core idea here is that recognizing injustice requires learning to see it, to understand inequality not as unfortunate but as produced. Storytelling and narrative matter in this work. Listening to experiences, especially those that sit outside dominant norms, helps reveal how systems of oppression actually function in everyday life. Disability studies places particular value on lived experience, context, and qualitative understanding, pushing back against purely clinical or reductionist approaches to research and practice. One framework we'll return to in this course describes five key commitments of inclusive education. First is togetherness, meaningful learning alongside peers, not separation by default. Second is belonging, recognizing and nurturing diverse ways of knowing. Third is affirmation, treating disability and intersecting identities as integral to a person's sense of self, not something to be erased or minimized. Fourth is opportunity, maintaining high expectations and access to intellectual challenges for all learners. And fifth is agency, supporting students to make choices, develop interests, and participate meaningfully in shaping their own learning. Finally, language matters. The words that we use to talk about disability carry assumptions, sometimes invisibly. Euphemisms like special, differently abled, or learning differences often aim to soften discomfort, but they also can trivialize or obscure real barriers. Disability studies doesn't offer a fixed rule book for language. Instead, it encourages attentiveness, noticing context, listening to preferences, and understanding that language reflects deeper beliefs about bodies, minds, and value. Throughout this course, we'll return to these ideas, not as abstract theory, but as tools for thinking critically about educational practice. The goal isn't to arrive at perfect language or perfect inclusion, but to become more aware, more reflective, and more responsible in how we think about learning in the context of disability.